One of the most iconic scenes from the game adapted to perfection, some very cheeky foreshadowing, huge remixes with Tommy, and of course, another week means another tragedy. Today I'm back to recap episode 6 of The Last of Us and talk about all these smaller details you might have missed, game parallels, and plenty of behind the scenes information. There are no future spoilers in this one, so if this is your first venture into the world of The Last of Us, fret not, you are in safe territory. We opened the episode with a very brief flashback to what happened with Henry and Sam before cutting 3 months later and seeing Joel and Ellie. Craig here mentions that this little cut-in was meant to be both a reminder of the tragedy that happened and that we won't simply forget it, but also to show us that a lot of time has passed. So we won't be dealing with the immediate fallout of that, but rather the more long-term thoughts of everything that happened. Also, this marks the first big difference in this episode, as in the game, after the death of Henry and Sam, we'd only be diving into the fall time, whereas the show goes right into the winter. Story-wise, it doesn't really change much all things considered, but in the game, there are these smash cuts to different seasons, usually after big events, and because the story is sequential, we first saw the fall, and the winter time would of course just be the next chapter. Again, nothing major, but visually, it is of course a pretty stark difference. Though speaking of changes from the game, we then meet this absolutely legendary couple named Marlon and Florence that are both add-ins for the show. I think I'm not alone in saying that I would honestly take a full 60-minute episode of them just talking back and forth, so this was straight up an excellent addition. Though story-wise, it of course sets up that air of mystique about the so-called river of death that we'd be crossing. Though also in the bigger story, as Neil adds, it also has this notion that it is possible to survive in this world if you just find a quiet corner. And so, this just functions as this moment of levity to not quite exhaust the audience with a constant barrage of loss and tragedy. Though as they're leaving the house, Ellie yoinks one of the rabbits, which I think made every game fan a little sweaty. More on that soon. Though story-wise, it's also here where we see Joel's first panic attack. First off, for everyone who's had one, I think I'm not alone in saying that this was almost uncomfortably realistic, so Pedro definitely nailed that. But secondly, it begins this through line in this episode that Joel is absolutely terrified about how he might fail Ellie, but he doesn't even know it yet. Neil here mentions that the changes from the game here were mostly just to fit the medium. In the game, because the gameplay sections don't allow for these intimate moments, Joel just sort of yo-yos back to being even more apprehensive and closed off toward Ellie. Which, of course, hints at that, I have to let her go, I can't open myself up to loss again, and someone else will do a better job than me angle. Whereas the show takes full advantage of the medium, and we totally embrace this fear and panic taking over Joel. So ultimately, it's the same expression, just told differently. And again, Ellie asks whether Joel will teach her to catch rabbits, which I think made game fans sweat even more. Cutting to the campfire, here we get another bombardment of foreshadowing and a lot of subtle character moments. First off, when Ellie asks about what happens after the cure and what they'll do, Joel once again fires back asking,
"Oh, it's we?"
Echoing the overall narrative of this episode that just so happens to be titled Kin. Joel pushing Ellie away out of fear of losing her, and Ellie being terrified about losing him because she clearly views him as her protector and father figure. As for their dreams, Ellie mentions that she wants to go into space and then suddenly becomes very serious. This is already the second mention of her talking about space, so who knows whether that has some deeper meaning there, huh? Though speaking of space, a small detail that I absolutely loved here is that Joel knows about Ellie's admiration of Sally Ride, which just ever so subtly tells you that no matter how much he has tried distancing himself, he obviously does care and listen. It doesn't even matter whether she has already mentioned it or Joel predicts it or whatever. What matters is that there is a clear connection there. And lastly for this little sequence, a ranch of sheep. This episode was seriously dead set on game fans sweating big time, wasn't it? Joel then tells Ellie to get some sleep and that he'd be taking both the first and second watch. Though soon thereafter, we cut to him being asleep and we see that Ellie was ultimately the one staying watch. First off, as Ellie starts listing off how she went about it, and finishing by saying that she did it just like he taught her, once again hammers home that sense of them getting closer and closer and that ultimately, they have been traveling for a very long time already. Though secondly, this is another instance of that fear within Joel, as yet again, he believes he has failed. He is angry because he believes he isn't capable of protecting Ellie. He believes his body has let him down. And that just reinforces that thought of Ellie looking after him instead of the other way around. And also, as we'd find out later in this episode, there's the angle of those terrible dreams he has. He says he has them every night. So in this case, I think it's fair to assume that he woke up with the feeling that he has failed something, and then the first thing he sees upon waking up is that yes, he did fail. Neil here also adds how for Ellie, this is a case of her slowly becoming her perfect image of Joel. Someone who she views as invincible, which is of course subtly building up those big emotion bombs later in the episode. A smaller thing to note throughout this episode are these random one-off conversations we see between Joel and Ellie. Be it learning to whistle, or talking about sports, or talking about campuses, etc, etc. Like I've mentioned throughout the season, a lot of these smaller moments between Joel and Ellie always happen in the gameplay sections while scavenging, so it's been really interesting seeing how these off periods are adapted for the show. And the funny thing here is that I've seen a lot of people not familiar with the game say that these scenes are too slow, they're fillery, etc, etc, which is exactly why they happen during the gameplay sections, and is in my opinion the perfect showcase of the balancing act that is adapting a video game story. Personally though, I could not disagree more. I absolutely adore these smaller moments we get, and I'd be all for them just scavenging and talking for like 30 minutes straight, sign me up. Though, I wonder what is the next story Joel might come up with for Ellie to believe. Skipping ahead a little, it's then that we arrive at the actual River of Death, and suddenly they are absolutely surrounded by people on horseback. This entire confrontation is an add-in for the show, and in the game, Joel almost accidentally stumbled upon Tommy's base. More on that in a second though. The big thing here is of course the dog that has been trained to sniff out infected. First off, I think that is a super neat idea, and I once saw how these doggos are trained, and how ridiculously specifically you can train them for specific things, so frankly, I don't think we should be worried about AI taking the world, but just super smart doggos. Jokes aside though, this is of course a deliberate callback to what we saw in episode 1. Ellie was scanned and confirmed infected, which immediately plants that scene in your mind that this dog will sense it. Only unlike the previous time where it was just this one dude, here they are completely surrounded and Joel simply freezes. Craig here talks about how they wanted to get this point across of this being a traumatic reminder of Joel. So his fight or flight response is actually the often overlooked third option, freeze. In situations of dire panic, 99.9% of people will not act rationally. Can confirm from personal experience, I turned into a buffoon and it was honestly embarrassing. Anyway, Craig here mentions that you'd expect Joel to go all out even if there was no chance of survival. It's not rational, but you would expect him to fight back. But in Joel's case, he doesn't. He just shuts down. Though luckily, the people here aren't here to kill Joel and are in fact a part of Tommy's crew. Which is when we cut to Jackson, marking another huge remix for the show. In the first game, all of these interactions and basically everything we see here happen at the dam, and we never actually see Jackson itself. And as it turns out, it is technically not even a change for the show, as it was always meant to be in the game. Neil explains that it was ultimately just a time and budget issue. They had concept art for Jackson in the game too, but just never got around to making it and just focused on the dam. We then actually see them come across a pen of sheep, which is definitely curious if you think about it. Though more importantly, we see Ellie briefly connect with this horse named Shimmer. Wonder if an extremely specific horse name will ever be relevant again. Cutting to them sharing a meal, this is a scene we never really got to see in the game, mostly because, again, their welcome is interrupted by an attack, and so we get right back into gameplay. Story-wise, here we of course see Ellie be super brassy and not very polite toward their new hosts. Though I wonder who that was looking at Ellie. Craig here talks about how this was just a case of Ellie's attachment to Joel. Her family is Joel, her tribe is Joel. This might be Joel's brother, but she immediately picks up on the fact that ultimately it's Maria who's in control. And because she has shown clear disdain for Joel, Ellie just becomes super protective. Cutting to Joel and Tommy though, here we get the first half of Joel finally breaking, as Tommy says,
"Just because life stopped for you, doesn't mean it has to stop for me."
Craig and Neil here talk about how this was just another one of those things in going from the game to a show. As in the game, you have these gameplay sections which interrupt these scenes, and so you can't quite stew on the emotion that much. Whereas the show allows us to go even deeper into what the character is feeling. And that is exactly what we see as Joel exits the bar and gets another panic attack. And worse yet, then sees someone that reminds him of Sarah. Craig here adds that this is ultimately meant to be Joel's breaking point. It's like a pan over the head that he's been chasing ghosts for literally 20 years. His life stopped with Sarah. For the past 20 years, he hasn't been living, he has just been surviving. And as much as Tess might have brought him back somewhat, that too was just ripped away from him. But then there's this little girl who might just be the key to curing this thing. And before we follow up with Joel and Tommy, we cut to Ellie and Maria. First off, again, we address the question of hygiene, which is always one of those amusing things about apocalyptic series that I think no one seems to want to think about. I mean, you know, it's all fun and games killing zombies until you have to wear the same underwear for a month. Jokes aside, here we see the chalkboard with two names, Kevin and Sarah. An immediate question that might pop up here, why is Sarah's death date the 27th? Well, it's as simple as her dying after midnight, there really is nothing more to it. Though of course, this is the first time Ellie learns of Sarah, and so she immediately connects the dots and simply says, well, that explains a lot. Maria of course continues to warn Ellie about Joel, but again, to her, this is just noise and she simply writes all of it off. Though they then go to see the movies, particularly the 1977 romantic comedy drama, The Goodbye Girl. I'm a zoomer, so I have literally no clue what this is, but Craig mentions that the movie was picked because while it might be your typical love story, it's more so about a kid saying, hey, he might be a good dad, which is of course a very on-the-nose parallel to Ellie. And similarly, the very idea of watching movies and listening to music and respecting art in general is of course also a signifier of humanity and society, just like we saw with Bill. It immediately tells you that we are past simply surviving and can enjoy the smaller things. Though cutting to Joel and Tommy, Joel finally comes clean about Ellie and says that she is actually immune. All while the shots are interspersed with Ellie wandering the town, which of course we now know was her looking for Joel and overhearing this entire thing. Though interestingly, the line about Joel having dreams from which he wakes up with this feeling that he has lost something wasn't actually originally in the scripts and was an idea from Pedro himself. Personally, I think the idea of even dreams haunting you is the perfect way of getting across that utter hopelessness that Joel feels, so in my book, that was certainly a great addition. And similarly, all the lines we get here of Joel just admitting he is weak, saying he's too old and deaf to protect Ellie, just bring this episode's narrative full circle. Especially with him also mentioning Henry and Sam, and about how even there he just froze. And it's after this that we get to the scene which I've been both dreading and eagerly anticipating. The confrontation between Joel and Ellie about how he wants her to go with Tommy. And unlike a lot of the scenes between Tommy and Joel, this one is ripped right out of the game. And for those of you who haven't played the games, now you probably understand why I mentioned the "I'm scared of ending up alone" sign last time.
Everybody I have cared for has either died or left me.
First off, Bella and Pedro acted the scene to absolute perfection, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't stop eating my big morning smoothie with a spoon to just linger on the emotion in this scene. This is easily one of my favorite sequences in the entire story, and that line of everyone leaving Ellie except Joel just punches me in the gut every single time. Like we've seen already, there is this clear push-pull dynamic between the duo. Ellie becomes more and more attached to Joel. As soon as episode 1, she saw him kill for her. She looks up to him, she wants to embody him, and above all, she views him as family. Joel, on the other hand, wants to push her away, not out of any dislike for her, but simply because he is afraid to lose again. And in this scene, we see him crack, because in the height of that emotion, Joel throws out,
He knows the area better than I do.
Do you give a about me or not?
Of course I do.
Then
suddenly, she is no longer cargo. She is someone who he wants to protect so much that he wants to give her to someone more capable than him. He thinks he is weak. He can't stand the fact that she was forced to protect him. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, this scene was absolute perfection. The only small changes here are regarding some additional smaller lines in the game, many of which Neil explains as just being a case of Joel's dialect differing between the two versions. So as much as the line of threading thin ice is iconic, they just thought it seemed a little odd with the TV version of Joel. And of course, following this very raw exchange, we get to the next morning where Joel is standing with the horse and using this cop-out of supposedly giving Ellie a choice, which is basically his way of saying, sorry Ellie, can we be friends again? And with that, they head off once more. And soon thereafter, we get the scene of Joel finally embracing the fact that he shouldn't be protecting her from all this violence. he should teach her and potentially allow her to simply avoid it. And so we get the scene of him finally giving her the rifle and training her how to shoot, which of course doesn't go too well the first time round.
You gonna shoot this thing or get it pregnant?
Again, because of gameplay differences, in the game, this whole rifle stuff happened way earlier. Though continuing their journey, Joel then mentions that he actually wanted to be a singer and not a shepherd. Makes me wonder whether or not we'll be seeing any of Joel's supposed singing career. Cutting ahead a little, we see them arrive only to see that the Fireflies are nowhere to be seen. The entire building has just been taken over by some very friendly monkeys. Though they also see a map that happens to converge on Salt Lake City, with a small piece of paper saying St. Mary's, marking what is supposedly going to be our next destination. Though soon thereafter, they see a group of supposedly bandits, upon seeing which, they immediately try sneaking out to get to the horse. Though as they near it, a dude jumps up behind him, who Joel quickly fights off with moves that are oddly reminiscent of the game, but as he turns to face Ellie, she notices that the bat that just snapped against the tree was now lodged into his stomach. This is a pretty major change from the game, where instead of it being a handle of a bat, Joel is sent flying from a balcony right onto a piece of metal pipe, and the whole thing just goes right through him. I have zero medical background whatsoever, so if I had to wager a guess, I think this is just a change for the sake of realism, as in the game's version, I think his organs would be scrambled eggs and he'd be dead then and there. And especially the rest of the sequence, in the game, it still has to have some gameplay, right? And so despite being impaled, Joel is still an absolute gigachad and still fires through the rest of the bandits right alongside Ellie. And so, as with most sequences thus far, the entire thing in the game is much more high octane, and they fight off like 20 more people throughout all of this, with Ellie straight up blasting most of them. Though in both versions, Ellie quickly notices that Joel is straight up dying, as almost right away he falls off the horse and is completely unconscious. And again, in both versions we see Ellie being overtaken by complete panic, just begging Joel, what do I do? Only in the game, we then smash cut to the signature screen of Winter, telling us that it is time for the next chapter in the story, while the show lingers on this scene as Ellie just keeps repeating,
Please, Joel, please.
And with that, we have come full circle. Ellie's seemingly invincible protector has fallen, and in what is almost bitter irony, Never Let Me Down Again starts playing. Though what honestly caught me off guard the most here is that this isn't some well-known artist or anything. This is Craig's daughter. He says here that they wanted to have some female vocals to echo Ellie, and purely practically, it would take months to find someone right for the job. So he just went down his hallway and asked his daughter to do this for the show. So, in a bizarre way, we have some serious fourth wall breaky parallels here, I suppose. Though yeah, just like with the Everyone I've Cared For sequence, this one was adapted to perfection in my opinion. Especially because we are already in the dead of winter, and so that depressing and dreary fall afternoon is remixed to be this stark contrast of Joel and Ellie being in the middle of nowhere and blatantly sticking out as these black specks in what seems to be endless snow. But with that, Joel's worst nightmare of failing Ellie has happened. So, where do we go from here? Has Ellie learned enough to survive on her own? Only time will tell. And with that said, that is episode 6, which despite the absolute tragedies, I think is my favorite thus far, and yes, I know I've been saying that almost every week. I don't know how they keep doing it, but even knowing the game's story, each and every one of these scenes smack me right in the feels, and I for one absolutely cannot wait to see what next week has in store. And that's the video. The extra long wait this week was a tough one, but I think it was more than worth it. I just cannot believe we're so close to the end already. But anyway, with that said, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.